Hello again. In this video, we're looking at clause 5.2 of ISO 9001 and ISO 27001. It also extends to 14,001 and 45,001s in principle, although we will look at those separately. I guess the starting point here, it's as good as any. We're looking at ISO 9000, like this is 9000 itself, the fundamentals and vocabulary standard. So this isn't a requirement standard, it is purely for guidance and is informative. Of value to us today is clause 358, which defines what a policy is in ISO terminology. So it's within the arrows, we've got a stipulation that it's attributed to an organization, and that the intentions and direction of an organization, as formally expressed by its top management, is what constitutes a policy. So there is a note there that basically makes it explicit that this is a core definition for all ISO management system standards that are adhering to the Annex SL hierarchy. So take it from there. Really, when we look at the requirements then for ISO 9001 and 27001, we need to keep this common definition of what a policy is in mind. Okay, so we close that out for now. Oh, by the way, there is an entry there, 359, on what a policy is, but I think we'll get enough of an overview of what it is by looking at the actual criteria itself. So here we are, clause 5.2 of ISO 9001. I think one of the things about the structure of this standard compared to 27001 is it just needs to be noted that clause 5.2 is broken into two subclauses, 521 and 522, while 27001 contains the same criteria, the same 7 bullet points effectively, but contained within one clause. It doesn't break it down into two subclauses, but effectively they read the same. Just to look at one difference, the obvious difference in the bullet points is that where 9001 refers to quality, 27001 will refer to information security. But the language will be the same otherwise, except for in bullet point A, 27001, it says is appropriate to the purpose of the organization. And when we look at 9001, it says is appropriate to the purpose and context of the organization and supports its strategic direction. You know, without going back to the criteria of clause 4.1, both standards differ in a similar way. 27001 is explicit only about the purpose of the organization, whereas 9001 includes the context and the strategic direction at clause 4.1. That's for the consideration of contextual issues. Okay, so what we're really kind of been asked to do in that, you know, context, if you like, is bring the results of the analysis of the application of the criteria of clause 4.1 and 4.2 into your policy development process. And so the policies should be appropriate to those aspects, the purpose, the context, and the strategic direction. So there's no real specific example I can give to any viewer of this video that's going to really nail it for you. You have to look at the context of your own organization to look at how this applies to you. Certainly we're available, you know, to consult on this, but a straightforward way of looking at it is that, you know, if your market expects you to treat particular aspects in a pre-described or predetermined way, those aspects should certainly be considered. I think the subsequent criteria here helps frame it a little bit. Okay, so provides a framework for setting quality objectives. Supplant the words information security for quality and as we read through this, but If we drop quality and just say it provides a framework for setting organizational objectives, quality and information security. I guess what an ISO auditor is looking for there is largely that you include some reference to the commitment made by top management to making sure the objectives and continual improvement objectives particularly are always being sought and resourced and facilitated and driven, and that they adhere to a framework which can be, the framework can be provided by principles. So for quality, we've got the 7 quality management principles. That's something that we'll talk about in another clip in detail, but that's available, and even through our ISO FAQ section, you can go there for information on those principles. You could also look at the information security related principles, such as data protection and privacy framework principles. So when developing a policy, what we're looking to do is use those principles to drive the policy development which supports and the actual strategic direction of the business and takes account of the context. So the simplicity sometimes is hidden in the language a little bit because of the complexity of the language. But yeah, if you've already looked at clause 4.1 and 4.2 to an extent that you're satisfied that you've looked at the relationships with all of your trading partners and your regulators and so on, that you've considered all of the issues that arise out of that and other contextual market issues, trends, and so on, and your policy then reflects all of that, well, you've got to keep in mind as well that it's at a fairly high level. Okay, keep in mind that it's a strategic level policy, and it should provide a framework for nearly everything, but in generic high level nature. The third part, or the part C of this clause, states that that the policy should include a commitment to satisfy applicable requirements. So we're being very specific here that those requirements are the ones that arise when you consider the needs and expectations of interested parties at clause 2. So where the organization adopts those requirements as organizational requirements, it's those requirements, those applicable requirements, the ones that the organization accepts and adopts, that they need to be considered here. And I've already mentioned continual improvement. For me, quality and information security objectives should always provide for improvement. So, we shouldn't have objectives to be normal. We shouldn't have objectives to be mediocre. Our objectives should always be to enhance and to improve. Don't let me kind of confuse objectives either with initiatives, which may go beyond requirements. But certainly, objectives and continual improvement for me go hand in hand. For me, I think, while we haven't looked at clause 10 in our video clips yet, we follow the life cycle approach. The continual improvement is managed throughout each section of this standard, because you've got to consider that an organization is at every part of the life cycle while it's up and running, because it's not that you go through the standard and leave clause 4 behind to move on to clause 5 and so on. It applies holistically to the business and is relevant at all times. I guess when it comes to the development of policies, the first couple are very easy to kind of tangibly move on, satisfy requirements. Well, the requirements are already established, but continual improvement, what does that mean? Well, essentially, if the organization is able to demonstrate that it's always seeking improvement and it has a mechanism in place for identifying and for managing improvements once they're adopted, Well, that's really where we're looking at, later on in the standard through, clause 6 for setting objectives, and clause 7 for resourcing them, clause 8 for making them happen, and so on. And I guess, setting a policy now is really aspirational, and just not to kind of put anybody off. Everything doesn't have to be complete and in place at this stage. Some of it can be aspirational, so long as it's obvious that what you state in your policy is something that you're striving to. So the fact that you might not have achieved everything to completion, so striving towards something can be a valid policy objective. So I guess the first part of the clause really does address the development and the establishment of the policy. The second part, communicating the policy, it applies equally to information security and the other management system standards. So what does it actually say? It says it must be available and maintained as documented information. We're all very familiar with, having a policy document and publishing them and maintaining them as policies. But keep in mind, particularly where ISO 27001 has a mandatory requirement for numerous policies, and they could exist in a collective document. And in fact, the statement of applicability, once you get there, is the place for that. But don't think that for each small policy that you need to have, that it needs to be a separately managed document. You can have numerous policies in one document. And a really good example that most organizations will be familiar with for such a document would be the collection of policies that would be housed within an employee handbook, for example. It may also be that an employment contract has numerous policies in various different clauses. So a policy does not have to be a standalone document. However, when you're considering clause 5.2, the requirement here is for a high level policy. Typically, these policies will be individual documents. So you will have a quality policy, you will have an information and privacy security policy, you will have a health and safety, or maybe an occupational health and safety policy. And likewise for environmental management, you'll have a similar policy document. Having said that, I think there's probably more than enough information to do with the development already being covered. Making it available as a document can be done either as a part of a collection of policies or as an individual document. And then point B of 5.2.2 speaks to the communication and awareness of the policy across the organization. Well, I guess internally there are the obvious obligations for an organization to make sure that relevant personnel within the organization are made aware of the policy and how it applies to their area of work, where the responsibilities are for the controls within that policy. Because typically a policy will provide some kind of governance or control to be adhered to. And I think, you can't expect people to adhere to a policy that you don't make them aware of, and you don't make them aware of their responsibility toward. And I think through the awareness clauses of the standard in clause 7, we'll be dealing with this in more detail. Point C there, lastly, is to be available to relevant interested parties as appropriate. One of the reasons why these documents are referred to as being high level is because oftentimes they're communicated externally. So they may be, in some instances, people might print them off and frame them and put them on display in a waiting or reception area. Others may use them to support requests for tender, which they need to be fairly concise and well printed and so on. Otherwise, communicating to interested parties may be that you publish them on the website, number one, or you might send them out as part of notification to shareholders, or with an annual general report for an organization. So publicly or internally, communicating policies to people who may have an interest. And it's relevant to every organization, and you need to consider it for yourself. But for me, the three key areas are, the high level policies. It's to your advantage to make them publicly visible, because it is a differentiator to have a good solid policy published. There are many references. I could give you to websites where you could go to see where people make them downloadable as well. And the other side of it is internally, they provide a good framework and give personnel a really good understanding of the principles that the organization works to. Lastly, but very much not leastly, is the use of policy documents and the expectation for documented policies in the formal tendering market. So hopefully this has been of help. Development of policies is critical to all ISO certifications. Please contact us through the website if you need any help. That's it for now. Happy days.